Hello everyone, so I get this question repeatedly placed on my wall from user Jeep2386, and I'm going to read these questions verbatim so I can answer them thoroughly and accurately. This person asks, does the minimum wage and legally approved health and safety laws deter the bad employer from abusing their workforce, or his or her workforce? If a worker, or indeed anybody, cannot earn enough to achieve a basic civilized standard, and I think it's spelt like a European or Australian civilized as opposed to American, so I guess they're from out of the country, standard of living, what happens to them? So answering the first question, does the minimum wage and legally approved health and safety law deter a bad employer from abusing workforce? Yes, specifically from the perspective of one thing, one narrow thing, a law that is intentionally geared toward incentivizing behavior can change behavior. Duh, of course. That's not a mystery. If you have a law that says it's illegal to do something, and there are people paid with guns who will come after you if you break this law, that incentivizes people not to do something. It's a threat of force. Of course, all laws are backed with the ultimate thought that death can result from disobedience. And that might surprise you to think about it this way. But every law, even as small as not wearing your seatbelt, even as small as jaywalking, is backed with the thought that death is an appropriate sentence. And you might be asking yourself, that makes no sense. How is that possible? It's just it's a ticket or a citation. That's not the point. The point is that if you resisted something, if you resist being arrested, if you resist doing the ticket, eventually the government comes for you. And if you resist the individual person to a point, they could cause you physical bodily harm, even unto death. Cops could shoot you. They could taser you. You have a heart attack. You die. They could pepper spray you in the mouth and hold you down and you suffocate and die. They can do things which kill you. And you might say, oh, but that's not going to happen. You just pay your fine. No, sorry. Disobedience to the law requires disobedience all the way through. That is why, if you want to take an extreme example, right? If somebody said, I don't believe in slavery, and I'm not going to have, slaves, or I'm going to resist being a slave if they were an African American at the time. If they resisted their masters, and they kept doing so because they morally or ethically felt that was wrong, that law was unjust, and they resisted all the way against all forms of restraint due to that underlying premise, that would lead to death. And that goes for any law. All laws are ultimately backed to the threat of force that can lead to death. So yes, will a law cause deterrence? Of course. When do laws not cause deterrence? When they're selectively enforced, right? When you look at laws that are only enforced here or there, or people break it so often that they can't really be enforced, and that comes down to, the executive discretion, police, or judicial discretion of prosecutors who say, I don't have time for this in my caseload, or a judge who says, okay, dismiss, I need to move on to bigger cases. They have discretion. So, those laws that are placed in there can deter employers from abusing people. Does that mean that if there's a law, there's no abuse? No, obviously. There's laws against murder. Do murder still happen? Of course. There's laws against theft. Does theft still happen? Of course. Why? Because they're only human beings, and people are going to do whatever they're going to do when their incentives, whether in their mind, acting rationally, irrationally, whatever, people are going to act the way that they are going to act. And, of course, people can be convinced to act better, but this is just saying in the general sense. If you don't have a system of eugenics in place where every person, is like, the book The Giver or something like that, where you are forced to conform from birth, and if you don't, then you get, beaten or medicated or something like that. When people have the ability to choose, they can choose to break the law. So, I hope that answers that first question, but it has no bearing on the philosophy and ethics of liberty. The philosophy and ethics of liberty are then asking, how did those laws get passed? Who are those people in power? How do they get their resources? And when you look at the mechanisms, they are built on theft. They are built on murder. They are built on a history of violence and a history of oppression, including the people who founded the Constitution did so at the exclusion of blacks and women and non-landowning white males. And so when you look at the history and you look at the documents, you look at the participation in the system is inherently oppressive. The system is inherently ruled by the few elite, those who have the most money and influence, affluence. It is a system that is built to threaten everyone and it gets by at a certain threshold because there's a comfortability level, and that's been whittled down over time. There was a time when, okay, as you know, at the American Revolution, if you offended someone's interest to a certain degree, people would revolt. There would be bloody revolution. Today, the government does things to indoctrinate people to serve it through public education. It does things to keep people in jail under certain types of laws that ensnare naturally rebels and people who are intellectually defiant. The system that has been created through the laws, through the education, is meant to help push down resistance. And that's why you might see the people who are more, placated by the fact that they can have their, Sunday night football, and they can watch, the rich kids of Beverly Hills, the Real Housewives, and as long as they have that and they have their Pepsi-Cola, they don't revolt, All right, so now look at the second part. If a worker, or indeed anybody, cannot earn enough to achieve a basic civilized standard of living, what happens to them? First, I have to ask, what is civilized standard? Subjective. What does that mean? Is a civilized standard, the average living in, Minnesota? Is it the average living in New York City? Is it the average living in Haiti? Who defines what civilized standard is? Who defines what the minimum modicum of necessity is for any human? We can understand objectively what human beings need in order to live. If you don't give them food, if you don't give them water, they could die. If you don't have a shelter from the elements, if there's a storm or if it's too hot, they could die. If they don't have certain types of physical functions met, you perish. Okay, we can understand it from that. Those standards, though, are not as high as necessarily what people might consider to be civilized standards. So that's relative. And again, a civilized standard. What is a right to a civilized standard? What does that mean? A right to something. Now, this is a difference between positive and negative rights. Negative rights means that someone has the ability to not be infringed against. Right? Someone might have a right to their life. Someone can't just come and murder them. They say, okay, that's my right to my life. The respect to the integrity of your body. They might have a right to things that they've worked for or earned. But a right to a third party's services or goods is not a right in all. That is slavery. Pure and simple. That's slavery. If I had a right to a teacher or education, that means I have a right to a third person's services regardless of what I give in return. That is slavery. I mean, to make it clear, if you had a right to a black doctor or a black teacher, would you be like, oh my gosh, what? That's crazy. Like, that's black slavery. Well, duh. Well, just because you apply it to everybody else, which is what government does with taxation, that's how they can get rid of the slavery element. When you put tyranny on the majority or on everybody, then it doesn't become tyranny anymore. And people begin to succumb to it because it's not so localized. If you put the taxes, if you put the cages on people in the grand scale, and everybody thinks, well, at least everybody else has to suffer. Or if they do suffer, they say, well, they should suffer because I had to suffer. It's a sick psychosis, Stockholm syndrome that happens with that. So moving on from that very loose standard, which has no rational reason as to why it was created or explanation, I can simply describe what happens if someone cannot earn to achieve a basic living or whatever. If somebody cannot make something, then they may suffer. They may die. They may be homeless. That's a possibility of existence. You're born naked. You're born into a world where you may have nothing and you're at the graces of your parents. Okay. Is that really weird? It sounds like all of human history. However, the question then that someone might be really getting at is what things can be done to make sure that people have good health, good food, good clean water. And that is done through free trade. That is done through people working together. The cost of products and produce and everything else comes down when people cooperate, when brains cooperate, when they have trade-offs, where someone is really good at something and they trade with someone who's really good at something else, and efficiencies emerge. That's how come people can have iPhones who are very poor. They may be poor, but they still can afford an iPhone, which is a magnificent marvel of modern technology. They could, people could still have clean water or food in the United States and still be relatively, quote unquote poor. People live at the lowest income level better than all the kings of the past. They have access to medicine. They have access to technology. They have access to transportation that people, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, couldn't have even dreamed of achieving in their time. And that comes through liberty. The rising up of the floor, in other words, the poorest becoming the richest as compared to their ancestors, comes through the freedom to trade, the freedom to improve, and the combination of respect for others, their body, and what they've worked for. Lots of people will have argumentation about what is consent, what counts as, capturing that is capturing property. This is an age-old, debate that is, law schools and property law and stuff like that. But the point is that there are standards that are historical, corroborable, as far as people's general senses about property acquisition and about the body. And that comes from empathy. It comes from human empathy and understanding. It's an ethical standard based on the reciprocity of the golden rule, effectively. I don't want to be stabbed. I'm not going to stab other people. That's a universal principle. I worked to cultivate a tree, and I'm picking the fruit that's on my land that I gated off, that I, took wood and built upon, or I trade with somebody with my service and time. People understand that type of ownership. It's measurable. It is actually objective. Yes, are there going to always be disputes and this and that on the fringes? Of course, that happens even with government. Even with government, they come in, they use eminent domain, they take people's property, they use taxes, they use all these arbitrary things for theft. But the goal with liberty, the goal with voluntarism, the goal with anarcho-capitalism or anarchism, if you want to use a less anarchist term, is to maximize consent, to minimize the initiation of violence, and those things lead toward prosperity and liberty and the growth of the intellect and the growth of philosophical foundations that respect other people, that build on the knowledge of the past and help integrate that into the future. The government does not want that. The government doesn't want a well-educated, critical thinking public. The government does not want people who are able to evolve beyond itself. People were evolving beyond it. The government had to use the public school system to stop that. We have space-age technology and stone-age philosophy, and that is a product of government indoctrination. It was not a product of the shared knowledge and technological innovations, especially after the Second Industrial Revolution and into the early 20th century. These things are all corroborable, they're historical, and as I said to this individual, the history and research is voluminous. It could take you years to research all this stuff, and you can go to great websites like Mises.org, you can go to the Center for the Stateless Society, and you can look at many of these historical documents, peer-reviewed journals, all this kind of stuff. If you want to do the research, you want to do the science, please do. It's not a simple task, just like any other great intellectual exploration isn't. You don't just get to be an astrophysicist without having done the legwork of working your way up. This is something that takes time, and it can't be truncated into 140 character tweet or message. So anybody else who wishes to grow their mind and to understand what it means to have true liberty and how to evolve ethically, and that not only will take place in bettering your social, your transactions as far as money goes, but your social interactions will be better. When you respect other people and you consider how you touch another person, or if it's even right to touch another person, or someone else's property or things, when you start to have that respect and stop assuming that you have a right to somebody else's stuff, it will change your relationships. It will make you less of a douchebag, basically, in short, in quick short. All right, so I hope that answers your questions, which, as you saw, there was a lot just to say even with those two sentences, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So thank you, everyone, for listening, and I'll talk to you all later.